Welcome back to TalkTickers, where we break down those earnings calls so you can just sit back, relax, and get all the insights you need. Today, we're going to be diving deep into Boeing's Q3 2024 earnings call.
Yeah, and guys,
This one's a doozy.
oh, you better believe it. Buckle up,
It's been a wild ride for Boeing the last few months.
to say the least.
To say the very least. I mean, they're dealing with, kind of a perfect storm here, a strike that's been going on, program delays, a brand new CEO trying to get everything in order.
Let's start with that strike, the IAM strike. It's been dragging on for how long now? Over 5 weeks.
Over 5 weeks, yeah.
And just today, the machinists union voted to reject Boeing's latest contract offer.
They did.
No quick resolution in sight.
Nope, not looking like it. And that's a real problem for Boeing's operations.
Yeah.
It's impacting production. We're seeing supply chain issues. And all of that ultimately comes down to their bottom line.
It's definitely hitting their bottom line.
Well-
We saw revenue fall by 1% this quarter, and they posted a core loss per share of $10.44. Yeah, and it's important to really break that down. I mean, we're seeing charges on some of those big programs, the 777X, the 767, and that's eating into profits.
Right, and that's separate from
Sure, right.
the impact of the strike itself.
Exactly. You've got kind of two things going on at the same time.
Speaking of the 777X, didn't they just announce another delay? That program just can't seem to get off the ground.
Oh, it's been plagued with issues. Certification problems are pushing that first delivery all the way to 2026, and that's led to a big $2.6 billion pre-tax charge this quarter.
It's like wiping out a chunk of their profit before they even sell a single plane.
It is. It really is.
So they've got this new CEO, Kelly Ortberg. He stepped in just a couple of months ago, and, investors are really watching him closely to see what he's going to do.
Of course they are. It's a tough spot to step into, but he's laid out a 4-point plan focusing on, changing the culture, stabilizing the business, getting those new platforms, executing on those, and then building for the future. But what I find really interesting is that his philosophy seems to be doing less, but doing it better.
Now, that sounds simple enough, but what does that actually mean?
I think it means streamlining operations, focusing on their core competencies, and getting back to basics.
So under Ortberg's leadership, we might see some pretty big changes in how Boeing operates?
I think that's a safe bet. One area where I think that less is more approach could be really interesting is their global services division.
Right, global services. That's been kind of a bright spot for Boeing, even with all the other, stuff going on. They've got good revenue growth, their margins are expanding, and they've got a pretty healthy backlog.
Exactly. But the question is, can they use that strength in global services to, address some of those financial challenges?
Okay, now you've got me intrigued. What are you thinking?
Well, think about some of the assets they have in global services. Jeppesen, for example, provides, that navigational data flight planning tools to airlines, pilots all over the world. It's a good business, profitable. But is it really tied to, Boeing's core manufacturing operations?
So are you suggesting they could maybe divest assets like Jeppesen?
It's a possibility, right? Selling off some of those non-core assets could bring in a lot of cash. And they could use that to pay down debt, invest in those key programs, really weather the storm while they're working on this turnaround.
And that would really fit with that whole doing less but doing it better philosophy.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting idea. It would definitely signal to investors that Ortberg is serious about, making some big changes.
Right.
But let's not forget about the other part of his plan, changing the culture at Boeing.
Yeah, that's a big one. They've been under fire for their internal culture for years. Concerns about accountability, transparency, that's not an easy fix.
Yes, especially with this strike still going on. These long labor disputes, they can really hurt morale, create division.
Oh, absolutely. Boeing needs to find a way to resolve this strike, and they need to do it fairly and quickly, to prevent more damage to their workforce and their reputation.
For sure. It's better for everyone to have those machinists back at work doing what they do best.
Right.
And then you have to think about the bigger picture, the whole aerospace industry. It's incredibly competitive. New technologies popping up, new players entering the market. Boeing can't just sit back and relax.
They can't. And that's why Ortberg's emphasis on building for the future is so important. It's not just about fixing what's broken today. It's about making sure Boeing is in a good position to succeed down the road.
So we've got a new CEO with a pretty bold vision, a company facing some serious challenges, and a lot of uncertainty about the future. It feels like Boeing is at a real crossroads.
They are. And the decisions that Ortberg makes in the next few months, they're going to have a huge impact, not just on Boeing, but on the entire aerospace industry.
Okay, so let's get into the numbers here. The financials. Boeing ended the quarter with $10.5 billion in cash and marketable securities, which sounds like, a pretty decent cushion.
Yeah, it does on the surface.
Yeah.
But you got to look at their free cash flow, which was negative $2 billion this quarter. That's the cash they have left over after paying for operations and investments. And when it's negative, that's a big red flag.
So that means they're spending more cash than they're bringing in.
Exactly. And it gets even worse when you look at their projections. They're expecting negative free cash flow for all of 2025. That's not a good sign. It means this turnaround could be, pretty long and bumpy.
Now, we talked earlier about Boeing possibly raising capital through, equity and equity-linked securities. Could you explain that a little bit more for our listeners? What does that actually mean for investors?
Sure. Basically, it means Boeing would issue new shares of stock or securities that can be converted into stock. You can kind of think of it like baking a cake, and adding more flour. You end up with a bigger cake, but each slice is smaller.
So existing shareholders would own a smaller percentage of the company.
Exactly. That's dilution. But on the other hand, that extra cash can help Boeing deal with their debt, strengthen their balance sheet, maybe avoid a credit downgrade. It's a tough balancing act.
Brian West, the CFO, he seemed pretty confident during the call that they have a plan to, work through these financial challenges.
He did. And they're already taking some steps to save cash, cutting back on spending workforce reductions. They're also working closely with suppliers to manage those costs and optimize the supply chain.
So for investors who are watching this whole thing play out, what are the key things they should be paying attention to in the coming months?
Well, first of all, watch for any news on that IAM strike. A resolution there would be huge. It would let Boeing ramp up production, start making more money.
For sure. And then, of course, any news about, those potential equity offerings or more divestitures, that's going to be really important.
Absolutely. And beyond that, keep an eye on how Ortberg implements his turnaround plan. Can he actually change the culture at Boeing, stabilize the business, improve execution, and really set them up for success in the long run? Those are the big questions.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see how this all unfolds. Boeing is a major player in the aerospace industry, and what happens to them affects the whole global economy.
It does. What we've learned from this deep dive into their Q3 earnings is that they're at a critical point. There are some big challenges ahead, but there are also opportunities if they make the right decisions. This is a story that's not over yet.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into Boeing's Q3 2024 earnings call. Thanks for listening to TalkTickers. We'll be back next week to break down another earnings call and help you make sense of the world of finance.